I'm going to try to talk tonight on a subject I'm sure all of you have heard about, because it's really one of the big topics of today, which is income inequality. Hopefully I'll give you a little different perspective and a little different vision of how to think about it, and hopefully that will help you see where we might want to go from a policy perspective. And I'll start by saying something that maybe sets the stage. I mean, we know that income inequality has become an enormous issue in the United States particularly, but in many other countries around the world. And I think it's something that we are going to do something about. And we're going to take actions to try to deal with the growth in income inequality that's happened. I think the question is, are we going to do something smart, or are we going to do something stupid? And that's really the question. And I think the way, hopefully, you do something smart is you have a good understanding of what's going on and really what potential solutions there might be and how they compare in terms of the desired outcomes. So let me give you some of how I look at income inequality and the growth of income inequality. And I'm not going to start with overall inequality, actually. I'm going to start with the wage differentials across different education groups. And I'm going to focus on what I'll call the educational premium, which is, think of it as how much more you earn if you either have a college degree compared to a high school degree, or a graduate school degree compared to a high school degree. So this is the premium on this axis. So if you go back to the late 1960s, the premium was running right about 40%. That meant if you were a college graduate, you earned on average about 40% more than a high school graduate. This was a key part of the early literature in economics on human capital that talked about investments in people and thought about, well, that 40% represented the premium you got if you had that extra investment in your skills and talents in the form of education. Over the 1970s, the return to schooling, the return to higher education actually fell, so that by the time we got to a low point here, which is about 1979 or so, the premium for having a college degree relative to a high school degree was in the low 20% figure. At that time, a well-known economist by the name of Richard Freeman wrote a book called The Overeducated American. He said Americans have become too educated. There were too many educated workers in the labor force, and as a result, the premium, there was not much reward to getting education. Okay, well, it turned out things turned around immediately thereafter. And we went from the low 20% figure in the 1979 to where we are basically today, which is up here in the upper 70s. So the premium for having a college degree basically tripled over that period of time. Most of the increase coming actually over the 1980s and through the 1990s. If you look at the premium for a graduate degree, it also went down over the 70s and then skyrocketed to like 140% by the time we get to the end. So what do you think about when you look at this graph? Well, one thing you could think about is, oh, this is inequality in the education space. Because obviously these people already earn more than high school graduates. Now they earn way more than high school graduates, and even more so if you look at graduates. But I think that's missing the other key message. You want you to think about this difference in prices, difference in wages between the high-skilled or high-educated groups and the low-educated groups as what we think of in economics as a price. It's telling us what the market is willing to pay to have a more skilled worker relative to a less skilled worker. What causes prices to go up? When does the price of gasoline go up? Only two things, really. More demand or less supply. That's really the story. That's what drives it. And the same thing is going to be going on here. So when you see the price of skill rising, you see the returns to education much higher than they were in the past, what you want to be saying is the market is saying we've not produced nearly as much of this stuff as the market demands. Okay? The second thing it tells me is that my return on investment, if I want to invest in these skills, is much higher now than it used to be. So you're in a world where we've invested less, the increase in supply is less than the increase in demand. That is, we've invested in some sense too little. And now we're in a situation where the return on investment is higher than it has ever been. What's the answer? What would that tell you to do? Invest. Okay, we're done, right? That's it. That really is an enormous part of the picture, is to realize that the growth in inequality is telling us something. It's not just about, oh, these guys benefited and these guys lost. It's not about winners and losers per se. It's sending a screaming message that the market we have not provided skills in the rate that the market demands. So one of the things we're going to try to understand, well, what lies behind this? What's driving this process? Maybe something crazy is happening, and that's why the market has done what it's done. Okay? All right, so that's the number one thing. Start thinking about inequality as sending a message other than Joe lost and Fred gained. That's not all the story. It's telling us something about what's going on in the marketplace. Now, it's not just education that tells the story. If you just look at overall inequality, that is just compare people at the high end of the wage distribution to people at the low, you see this kind of picture. If I look at the 10th percentile workers over this roughly, this is like a 50-year period almost here. Over that whole period, almost no growth in wages for people at the 10th percentile, most of the growth happening at the top. This is for men. This is the story for women. Now you can put these two together on a graph that I really like. It doesn't show you the time series, but it shows you the total effect of what happened over that period. This axis measures the growth in wages, and I use a scale that economists love and everybody else hates, which is a log scale. And this is growth over a 40-year period, from 1970-72 to 2010-2012. That's a 40-year span. So if you know anything about compound interest, over 40 years, 0.4 is like 1% a year. That's the way to think about it. 0.6 is 1.5% a year. 0.8 is 2% a year. That's how a log scale works, and that's why we love log scales, because you can measure compound interest so easily on this log scale. But for those of you who hate logs, just think of this, as measuring in some sense the percentage, with this being 1%, 1.5%, 2% on an annual basis. What does this picture tell us? Well, I got the percentile that you're looking at on this axis, and I got the growth in wages on this axis. So let's focus first on men. What do you notice? This line basically is sloping up throughout its entire range. What does that mean? Well, who had the greatest wage growth? People at the top. Who had lesser wage growth but still a lot? People near the top. So no matter where you look on the spectrum, if I compare 40 and 50, 50 and 60, 60 and 70, you see that the amount of wage growth we had is higher the higher up the distribution you go. That is, you can think about the wage distribution just kind of stretched out. We just pulled it apart. That too is a very important message, because it tells us this is a very pervasive effect. Many of you have been listening to public policy debates for a long time. How many people remember the underclass discussions, right? The underclass. The underclass story was, these guys here, they're doing badly, everybody else is doing okay. Then we had the declining middle class. Oh, these guys are doing terribly. Now we have what? We have the super rich. Everybody's doing terribly other than the guys who aren't even on my picture. They're way out here, way to the right. And what this picture tells you is that if you look at this longer time frame, none of those stories really tell the full story. This is a very pervasive phenomenon. Whatever's been happening has driven wages, better conditions for the 40th percentile than the 20th, 20th than the 10th, 80th versus the 60th. What does that tell me? The explanation here cannot be corporate boards of directors who are not policing their executives. That doesn't explain why this guy did much better than that guy. Neither one of these guys is in the boardroom. They're not even close to the boardroom. Nobody on this picture is in the boardroom. Okay? Nor is it all about welfare programs. right? They're all, you know, it's not about those extremes. This is about something fundamentally has been happening in the economy over the last 40 years. The other thing I learned from this is it didn't all happen at once. This wasn't all Bill Clinton. This wasn't all George Bush. This wasn't all Barack Obama. It wasn't all concentrated in any period of time. I see it within women. Now there's one key dimension on which inequality shrunk, which is women did better than men. They were across the spectrum. It's true, high-wage women did much better than low-wage women in terms of wage growth. But still, if you look at these two pictures, women are always above. In fact, almost above by the same amount throughout. So the one gap that's closed, and that's going to help us also we're also going to be able to understand that. So I view those as some of the key facts. Okay, key facts to explain. What's caused the price of skill or price of high ability labor to go up relative to low ability? And secondly, why has it been so pervasive that it's affected men and women and throughout the distribution? All right. I'm going to skip this. Oh, actually, I will talk a little bit about this. This actually does it by decade. And you actually can see from this that in the 70s, basically, most of the inequality growth was in the lower half. The 80s were actually the period of the greatest growth in inequality. That's the biggest slope. The 90s, the 90s are actually something to the middle class did relatively poorly. What's really interesting is the 2000s are actually the slowest growth throughout the period. Now remember, this is all happening on top of what already happened before. That's, I think, why it's so much in the news, because it's a cumulative effect of all these changes. Now you might ask, well, what about the 1% versus 99%? And actually, I'll just give you a quick picture. This is what happened to the premium of the 1%. Remember my education graph? The scale was 0.2. Okay, well, the 0.1%. The 0.1%, this is the top 1/10 of 1%. Historically, the premium for them was about 20. That's a lot. That means they earned roughly 21 times the average. And that 21 became 70. But how much did the college premium go? It went from like 20% to like 70%. In fact, if you do the picture, they went up almost the same amount. It's just one was a lot bigger to begin with. So again, it's a common story of what's going on here. So now we're left with a question. What accounts for the growth in the demand for skilled labor? And I'll tell you, the answer is the same forces that generate economic progress. And I'm going to show you a picture of progress. This is a picture of progress. This is, again, my favorite log scale. Those of you who don't like logs, yeah, tough. Anyway, so that's the log scale. That's the University of Chicago approach, by the way. You know, if you don't like it, tough. I learned that from George Stigler, for those of you who know. He was very famous for his not caring attitude. Anyway, so this is the log of real per capita GDP. The blue line is the actual data, and the orange line is, or yellow line is a trend line fit to that. When you look at this graph, what do you see? Well, there's a couple things that jump out at you, one of which is the Great Depression. Great Depression was an enormous event, okay? You can't look at this graph and miss the Great Depression, right? It's right here, right? You see the Great Depression there, right? Okay. You also see the Great Recession, right? No, you see it? It's right there. It's right there at the end. Now, that's not tiny. Look at this scale. This scale that's 50 log points there, 0.5 in logs. That's huge. That's about, from where we were above trend to below trend, that's about 10 or 11 percentage points. That's about what we're short of where we think we ought to be at this point. So that is the Great Recession. But remember, the Great Recession and the Great Depression have one thing in common. They both start with great. Okay, that's about... They are not they're not dissimilar events. We have tough times, but not those times, okay? The Great Recession the Depression was an enormous contraction in output relative to what we see today. Now, but when I see this graph, What I focus on is this gold line. That is, how have we gotten so much richer than we were 120 years ago? We've continued to move up the line. And the question is, what pushes us up the line? Well, economists have identified really three major things that push us up the line. One is improvements in technology, what we call technological progress. We're getting to know how to do things that we didn't used to know how to do. Go back to my graph. What was the world like in 1890? A lot of things we didn't know how to do in 1890, right? This is like pre-automobile, essentially. Basically pre the major electrification, right? There's a lot of things that are going to happen. Computers that weren't even in anybody's mind at the time. So we're making progress. And as we make progress, those new technologies allow us to produce more output with the same amount of inputs. We get more and more productive, and that allows us to grow real GDP. As we make those new technologies, we invest in the physical capital necessary to utilize those new technologies. And we invest in the human capital, that is the workers needed to develop those technologies and implement those technologies. And I will add a fourth factor that often gets left out, which is growth in markets. That is, markets can also contribute to improving the allocation of resources and pushing us up that gold line. But there's a side effect. So all these things are great, right? You want to think of those as great things. They help us grow. They help us move up the line, raising our standard of living. But in the process, they have another effect. So all these things are pluses in the output dimension. But if you ask what has been their effect on the relative demand for skilled and unskilled workers, basically technological progress tends to raise the demand for skilled workers and lower the demand for less skilled workers. Early on, it was getting rid of a lot of physical labor. Go back to 1890. Many of those human beings working in the marketplace were basically beasts of burden, right? They basically provided physical energy in the jobs that they did, or the most menial of physical tasks. We replaced many of those early on in the 20th century. Further down the road, we started replacing machines, other activities with machines. The physical capital came in, taking the place of low-skilled workers. Again, physical capital tends to be a complement to high-skilled workers, a substitute for low-skilled workers. I'm not going to get into too much detail. Markets have basically worked in that same direction, one of which is kind of trade and other factors like that. The one thing that has acted in the opposite direction, that is, has kept the skill premium down, right? All these things are raising the demand for skill, and if you don't increase the supply, prices are going to go up. The one thing that's constantly pushing against the trend to having a rising inequality and rising skill premium is that you invest in human capital. That human capital pushes you further up the the yellow line, and at the same time keeps the skill premium from rising. The way you want to think about the economy is this. We have technological progress, investments in physical capital, and invest in developing markets, all of which are increasing our real standard of living, but also raising the demand for skilled workers and lowering the demand for less skilled workers. Investments in human capital are contributing to growth by replacing less skilled workers with more skilled workers, but also holding down the skill premium by increasing the supply of skilled workers and reducing the supply of less skilled. It's like a race. We got the demand side pushing up skill premium, supply side holding it down. Now, that basically summarized. This is a model that Larry Katz and I did based on exactly that, and we ran this model basically through here. This is out of sample, worked really well. I like to show this figure because it's my best out of sample forecast ever. But if it had failed, I wouldn't have showed it, so I'm cheating. But anyway, so that's the basic idea. So what happened? What explains why the skill premium went up so much post-1980? Any ideas? Only two candidates. Remember, I'm an economist. I only know one tool, supply and demand. And since I only know supply and demand, that leaves two choices. Either demand grew very quickly or supply grew very slowly. And I'll tell you the basic answer is this. The demand side has been growing forever. That's not new. Growth in the demand for skilled labor has actually been going on for the whole century. What happened is supply stopped keeping up. That is the growth in supply. In fact, what caused the premium to go down in the 70s? Does anybody know? Why did the premium for schooling go down? Why did we have so many educated workers coming in the labor market in the 1970s driving down the premium of education? Well, Vietnam's part of it, but actually a small part. Yes, we had two things that happened at the same time. One is, throughout the post-war period, education levels were rising. And by the time we got to the 70s, we had giant baby boom cohorts coming into the labor market who were so much more educated than the people already in the labor market. I want you to think about the labor market like a bathtub full of water. Okay? And the education level of the population, of the working population, you can think of as like the temperature of the water in the bathtub. Okay? So when is it that the temperature rises quickly? How do you heat up a bath very quickly? Well, number one, you got to put water in that's a lot hotter than the water in the tub, right? It's how much hotter is the water coming in the spigot than is the water in the tub. In 1970, the water coming in, the education level of those new cohorts was much, much higher than the education level of the population. And the spigot was on full blast. That caused the temperature of the water in the bathtub to rise very quickly. Okay? By the time we get to 1980, what's happened? The water's pretty hot now. And the water coming in isn't any hotter than it used to be. So now there's got a really little gap between the temperature of the water coming in and the temperature in the tub. We're not increasing the supply of skilled workers very quickly at all. The baby boom is waning, so the volume of water coming in is shrinking. So we start falling behind in terms of how quickly we're increasing the supply of skilled workers. And basically from 1980 on, we kept falling further and further behind. And as we fell further and further behind, the premium went up and up and up. Well, you say, well, geez, that doesn't make any sense because I took economics, and in economics, when prices rise, supply responds. Why aren't we creating more of this stuff if it's in such demand and has such a high return? Now I'm going to take 1 second and step aside before I answer that question. I'm talking about everything today in terms of education. But education is only one of very many skills out there in the labor market. And as my earlier graph shows, the returns to skills have gone up much more generally than the returns to education. The returns to skills are up across the board. Now, why do economists focus on education? Because it's the easiest thing to measure. It's the one question. If I go into your house and I say, how much skill do you have? Take me forever to figure out like really how good you are at anything, but I can ask you how many years of schooling you have. So it's kind of like the thing we can measure. I think of it as a metaphor for more generally what's going on in the skills spectrum. Because if you talk to employers today, they'll tell you it's not just about education, it's about skills on lots of dimensions. So I don't want you to think I'm all about education. Education's important, but it's not the only one. But let me show you what happened on the supply side. Well, this blue dots are the premium for going to college. And the red dots are how many people went on to college. My God, the theory of supply works. That is, when the return to going to college went up, more people started going to college. And to me, I love this graph, right? It's like economics works, okay? People respond. You know, the idea, people always say, well, people are too stupid. They don't understand. They don't know. They know better than us. They saw the writing on the wall. In fact, economists didn't start writing about the pricing premium to education till like about here. People had already responded before economists even knew what was happening. It's pretty interesting. People got the message. Unfortunately, the message didn't do them that much good because that's how many people went to college. But if I look at how many people actually completed, this is for men, A lot of these guys went, but they didn't finish. Most of them didn't make it through. That if I look at the completion rate, it basically never got above where it was in the early 70s. So in fact, the completion rate here never gets above where it used to be. There basically been no response in terms of the ultimate goal of getting through the college. Almost all those people who went on that wouldn't have gone on ended up not finishing. Why? What could it be? Well, one, people would say, well, they can't afford it. They can't afford to go, so that's why they're not going. I think that's not the right answer. I think the right answer is they weren't well prepared. They were not prepared to succeed in that education because they hadn't got a good education to begin with. One of the most important things, and I teach on human capital, one of the most important things to remember about human capital is a cumulative process. That is, you build the next layer of human capital on the human capital you already have. And if you don't have the starting, if you haven't built up till now, it's very hard to catch up. So one of the things I think is going on here, and I'll show you some stuff that'll push you in that direction, is that this is a sign that people see what they need. I mean, all you got to do is watch late night TV now, right? It used to be late night TV was all what? Ginsu knives and stuff like that, right? Now it's all University of Phoenix and University of New Hampshire. It's all people are clamoring to figure out how they're going to make it in this world, right? The world has changed dramatically. But the problem is a lot of these people are not well positioned. Now the story for women is actually a lot rosier. That is, women went up and went on to college just like men, but unlike men, increasing numbers of women were finishing. A lot didn't finish, but a tremendous number of them did. Okay? Why do you think that is?
They're smarter.
They're better prepared. They are better prepared than men. That is, particularly if you focus on the incremental women who went on who weren't going. There are a lot of very well prepared men. Most of them were already going to college. They're not part of this population. The part of the population that was responding among women, there were a lot of talented women who were not currently going to college. In fact, there were more women who were college ready than there were men. And when the demand for college went up, women not only saw the need to respond, they were able to effectively respond. Okay? And there's a few things you can look at. And Gary Becker and I wrote a paper exactly on this kind of point. We tried to show why it was that women were so much better positioned to succeed in college. Now, a couple things you can look at. One would be like high school GPAs. And you can see women have always been better students than men. Always. Been true forever. And so when that demand for education went up, they were much more well positioned to respond. Particularly true if you take out the most high achieving men who were already going to college. This gap would get even bigger if you focused on that incremental group. Actually, women do better than men when they get to college. This is actually the distribution of college GPAs for men and women. Now, of course, there's a lot of grade inflation, right? So you can see that like the average GPAs are way over here, but nonetheless, women are much more overrepresented in the top groups. Men are much more overrepresented in the lower groups. So I think there's a lot behind this story that women were in much better position to succeed in college than men. All right. Now, so what does that tell us? It tells us, well, the only way we're going to counteract the growth and inequality that we've seen, and the only way we're going to drive that education premium back down, again, go back to the only thing we know in economics, supply and demand, is one, slow the growth of demand, right? That'll work. If we slow the growth in demand, keep supply growing at some rate, we'll eventually catch up. Or two, increase the growth in supply. That's it. You go, those are two choices you got. And that's the way you're going to narrow the gap. You're not going to narrow the gap in any other effective way. Now, why I would argue against slowing the growth of demand. Why? Why do I think slowing the growth of demand doesn't make a lot of sense? Well, because yes, the growth in demand is coming from this. You don't want to slow this down, right? Slowing demand is like saying, okay, I'm going to make less progress. Not a good way to help people, right? You might effectively narrow inequality, but you'll do it by lowering the standard of living pretty much for everybody. You don't want to do that. So the answer is you got to grow supply. Well, and the other reason to grow supply is the point we made at the first slide. The rate of return is high. Great idea when the rate of return is triple what it was 3 decades ago is grow supply. You're going to get a much greater return on your investment. That's the good news. The bad news is it's a tough process, okay? Number one reason it's a tough process is it took us 30-something years to get ourselves in this mess. It's going to take us a long time to get out. Why is that? For a second critical feature of human capital, and I think this is one we often forget. Human capital, that is investment in people, is a form of investment. But it is one of the longest lived investments that we have. Think about educating somebody in elementary school. That person, say, is 8 years old. That person's going to retire at 68 years old. That means that asset that you're creating is going to be in use 60 years from now. There ain't that many assets we're investing in today that are going to be in use 60 years from now. Okay? What that means is if you've made a mistake, you got to live with it for a long time. Okay? And we've had 30 plus years to dig ourselves a hole. We've accumulated quite a debt in the human capital account. We're way behind where we would be if we had enough to keep inequality from growing. So it's going to take us a while to grow. Third feature of human capital, it takes a lot of time to build it. Let's assume you could fix the education system for kindergartners today. Just snap your fingers, education system fixed tomorrow. When do those kids hit the labor market? Yeah, they hit the labor market at 2030 something. When do they become half the labor market? 2055 or something like that, right? We're talking a long run solution. And yet you have all those other people. But now I'll give you the one, I think the number one silver lining on the investment side, which is remember the driving force here is supply and demand. So we have too many low-skilled workers, people that we didn't invest enough in. And in many cases, it's going to be very difficult in any quick period to increase people's skills. But let's say there's 25% of that group that we can help. We can go in there and we can get, by getting charter schools, by getting more school choice, whatever it is, we can help 25% of that group. People say, well, this isn't going to work because you can't help everybody. We have to have tax reform or redistribution because that's the only way you're going to help everybody. And I think that's wrong. Because if you can take 25% of that low-skilled population and move them into a more skilled category, what happens? Well, they benefit enormously because the return to education and the return to skills more generally is much greater than it used to be. They're going to get a big gain in income as they move up the economic ladder. But what's going to happen to the 75% of guys who are left behind? They're going to do better too. Because there's going to be less supply of those low-skilled workers, which is going to push up wages at that end of the labor market. And therefore, even though you're only helping a subset, you're really helping everyone. And the one thing we know in this market is supply and demand really matters. The 1970s with the baby boom coming in told us supply matters. The 1980s with the baby boom dearth and the slow growth of education, supply matters. Supply matters a lot. And so if we can get some of these workers out of that group We can help them directly by getting them more skills and a better life, and helping them the others indirectly by improving the labor market for them. I got one more feature of human capital that I want to bring forward. And it's a key difference between physical capital and human capital. And that is, you take human capital home with you at night. When you go home, you bring your human capital with you. And one thing we've learned is that the same deficits that we see in the labor market are starting to show up in the household as well. Whether it's health outcomes or investments in children, that the lack of human capital is not just hurting people in terms of what they can earn, it's hurting them in the household activities as well. Whether it's raising their children, taking care of their own health, taking care of their financial health, all those different aspects. Again, targeting education and improving skills is going to help not just them earn more, but actually be more successful in the household. I want to make out one final point. So as I've told you before, demand for skill keeps going up. Supply has fallen short. We have too few skilled workers, too many low-skilled workers. Think of it in very simple terms. Does economics stop there? No. What's going to happen when the wages for skilled workers are high and there's not so many of them? How do you get more skilled labor? They work more. They just work, each of the skilled workers work more. What happens in the low-skilled population? Exactly the opposite, they work less. And I'll show you a picture from paper Bob Topel and I did. This is, again, this is percentiles. And this is how many hours per week people used to work as a function of where they were in wage distribution. And this is back in 1970 to 72. High-skilled workers worked a little more than everybody else, but not that much more. Today, hours worked fell at the bottom and went up dramatically at the top. That's supply and demand at work again. Demand's up, prices are up. These guys are supplying more. Demand's down, they're supplying less. That's men, that's women. Just an enormous contrast. That is, and now what does this do to inequality? What does this do to inequality? Remember I told you before, if we invest in low-skilled people, create more, we move some of those low-skilled people to high-skilled workers, that'll lower inequality. Because that'll push down wages at the top end and push up wages at the bottom. What does this do to inequality? This raises inequality. These guys are working less. They not only have lower wages, they're working less. That lowers their income even more. These guys not only have really high wages, they're working even more. So this response, which happens when you don't make the other response, exacerbates rather than contracts inequality. Okay? Now, you hear another alternative. And the most commonly cited other alternative is, I got the answer. Let's just tax the crap out of these people and give the money to those people. All right, what'll that do? What will that do to the supply and demand balance? That'll further reduce investment. That won't increase investment. That'll lower investment. So pre-tax inequality will go up even more. That's not good. And what happens? Are we taking advantage of the high returns? The market's screaming at it. We need more skilled workers. I got a great answer when you need more of something. Tax it. That's the answer. You need more skill. Let's tax skill. That'll get us more. No, it won't. That's the issue. You really got to think about what's the response going to be. Okay, throw that aside. Okay, forget it. I don't care. I don't believe people respond, even though all the evidence says they do. Let's assume we don't. And let's say we tax these guys and we give the money to these guys. What's going to happen in the household? Is that an equal society? Is that an equal society where these guys are earning money and these guys are getting money through the redistribution? I hate to think about the kids growing up in that household. That is not a good environment for them. I think the data are overwhelming. They tell us we need to do the hard work of improving education, and in particular improving education, and not just formal education to get people to go to college, improving the skills of a broader set of the population that will help those people directly and allow them to take advantage of the enormous rate of return that's out there, that's being evidenced by the growth in inequality, and at the same time counteract the growth in inequality by shifting the supply and demand balance. Seems to me a very nice solution. It sort of takes advantage of the high rates of return, helps the individuals directly, and indirectly will work to lower inequality. The problem is it's a long-term project. It's something that's going to take a while. But it takes a while for two primary reasons. One, we're dealing with human capital. It's a very long-lived asset. You don't change on a dime for assets that last 50, 60 years. Number two, it's going to take a long time because it took us a long time to get into this position, right? It's not like we're 1985 and we're responding to 5 years of falling behind. We're responding to 35 years of falling behind, right? Taking a while. And, you know, but to me, that's where we need to go. And I think that's the kind of policy that we need to do. Now, the pessimistic side that sometimes I hear, and I have a little sympathy for it, is, well, you know, think of this train that's been pushing us up that red line, the technological train that's been increasing standards of living. One answer is, well, you're not going to outrun that forever. It's going to catch up to you at some point. But my point is, we haven't run out of our limits on running up. There's too many people out there that we're not educating well enough. We already did it once. In the early post-war period, we opened education and skills to a much broader set of the population and reaped the benefits. We can do that again if we can bring in more of the people who don't have those opportunities today.